Hey everyone, Mr. Wineland here. As we are going through a new chapter, chapter 9, we are talking about the origins of progressivism. We've been talking about the urban situation, the urban cities growing during this time frame. And obviously, as cities are growing, the inner urban cities, this is causing some new problems, some new situations, and ultimately, you're going to see that there's going to be need. There's going to be a need for solutions. Problem is, the government really didn't know what to do or want to do anything, and so it's going to be the people having to speak for themselves and put the political pressure, really kind of poke at their local senators and their local congressmen and women to basically do something, or mostly congressmen at that point in time. Not going to have congresswomen. Sorry, we're not going to be able to have congresswomen until later into the 1930s. But we see that progressivism would really start out pretty small. We see, for an example, the reason why they would want to start the progressive movement is for things like child labor and the situation of like Kamala Tioli, basically a 12-year-old girl in Lawrence, Massachusetts, working at a textile mill to help support her family. Went through a tragedy, getting caught in a machine, used for twisting cotton and thread, tore off a part of her scalp, and the young Italian immigrant spent 7 months in a hospital, and was scared for her life. And then 3 years later, when 20,000 Lawrence mill workers went on strike for higher wages, she was actually testifying in a Congress committee, and she told them, because I didn't get enough to eat at home, of why she had to explain why she had to go to work. Not even at the legal age of 14. She was at 12. You're supposed to be 14, but she went at 12, and really kind of putting a damper on the idea of child labor and the conditions of the modern day worker. We're seeing that people are trying to do something, make changes, make some growth in this part of the United States. Um, we see that in the early 1900s, middle class reformers addressed these problems. Here's your definition to the progressive movement right there. And then you have your answer to number two is right here in these. But we started to see that middle class reformers are really the ones really stepping in and doing something in the 1890s. Journalists are also writing about these certain problems with women and children. Intellects as well are questioning the American society. We're seeing political reformers are coming in, and they're dealing and forming what is called, trying to call for reforms, which ultimately is called the progressive movement, which is aimed at to restore economic opportunities and correct injustices in American life. We see that they want to solve the problems and bring solutions to these, and they had some goals, and that was protecting social welfare, promoting moral improvement, creating economic reform, and fostering efficiency. So obviously looking after everybody and their safety, but also the moral improvement and making sure that we are looking at being fair, and that everybody is being protected, creating economic reform, providing more opportunities, more money, and then fostering efficiency, making sure that people can get their work done at a timely rate and not be pressured to do a lot of work that they are unable to do. So we see a lot as far as the social welfare. We're seeing reforms dealing with harsher conditions. We're seeing that social gospel settlement house movements of the late 1800s aim to help poor through the community centers. Social services in the progressive era, we see that Young Men's Christian Association is creating open libraries, sponsoring classes, built swimming pools, handball courts. Salvation Army fed the poor with people soup kitchens, cared for the children in nurseries, kind of like daycare centers, slum brigades to instruct poor immigrants in the middle class values of hard work and temperance. And then you start to see other political activists like Florence Kelly, your definition here for her, basically was trying to improve the lives of people. Was appointed chief inspector of factories for Illinois after she had helped win the passage of Illinois Factory Act in 1893. The act was to prohibit child labor and limited women's working hours, and became a model of other states, and really kind of making sure that people were protected in the workplace. So other reformers were dealing with the aspect of morality. We're seeing not just the workplace of making sure safe conditions, but also improving people's lives. Some people focusing on poor people, wanting immigrants and poor city dwellers to uplift themselves and their personal behavior. One of the biggest things is that the biggest issues, and especially modern city, was alcohol. Alcohol was a big deal, and we see the the banning of alcohol, which is prohibition, was become popular in the 1870s. Would start out. A lot of different prohibition groups would come in and dealing with alcohol, deeming it immoral. Founded in Cleveland, 1874, the Women's Christian Temperance Union, WCCTU, spearheaded the crusade for prohibition. We see members advance their cause by entering saloons, praying, and urging saloon keepers to stop selling alcohol. We see that a lot of religious groups get behind this, believing that alcohol is sinful and that it causes a lot of problems. We see that Francis Willard, from small Midwestern religious group in 1879, in national organization boasting 245,000 members by 1911, and WCTU became the largest women's group in nation's history. We see that they would grow over time, trying to do everything, with slogans like "Do Everything" slogan, and began opening kindergartens for immigrants, visiting inmates in prisons and asylums, and working on for suffrage, trying to figure out ways to protect people. Um, we do see that the reform activists, like those of settlement house movements, provided women with expanded public roles, which they could justify giving women voting rights. We also see that sometimes efforts of prohibition led to trouble with immigrant groups, such as the case of Anti-Saloon League, founded in 1895, as members sought to close saloons to cure society's problems. Tension arose between them and many immigrants who chose customs often included consumption of alcohol. Immigration, alcohol was a big source of immigrants go. Alcohol was a big part of their lives. You see some individuals would really want to really cause problems um, during the time of this movement. Like Carrie Nation is one of those who would carry out, and she's kind of down here. Well, I can't show it to you because I have it on the thing, but I totally forgot that um, I can't show you the picture, so that's my bad. But Carrie Nation was one that would go in and really confront alcohol, or saloons with alcohol, and would break bottles and just destroy the property and really trying to send a message. But that type of movement wasn't working and helping. We do see that a lot of immigrants really needed the saloons to be open, because it was more than just a place to go get a drink. It provided a place to cash their paychecks and serving meals to some of the immigrants' families and their communities. So it was more than just, well, it was just a bar. So we see more reformers are also looking at individual behavior. During the severe economic panic, Americans questioned the capitalistic. So as you had more reformers dealing with individual behavior, you had others working on the idea of the economic panic of 1893, which you've kind of addressed in previous chapters, dealing with the capitalistic system. So we see that as a result, we see some Americans, especially workers, are embracing socialist aspects, like the labor leader Eugene V. Debs, who helped organize the American Socialist Party in 1901. Basically committed commented on uneven balancing among big business, government, and ordinary people under the free market system of capitalism. Most progressives were trying to distance themselves. Like, progressivism wasn't about, oh, we want to create socialist plans or policies. That necessarily wasn't the idea. Yes, they wanted to kind of see a little bit more support, creating some safety nets, some more support systems that certain immigrants or certain individuals didn't have. But they really wanted, but the idea was just kind of make the workplace safer, create opportunities for people, and really just make some slight changes in the way we live our lives. Big business was often received as favorable treatments for the government officials, and politicians could use the economic power to limit competition. We do see that journalists eventually would kind of play a part dealing with big business and the economic reform. We do see that a new form of journalism would form called the muckrakers or muckrakers. Sorry, muckrakers. Basically, we see that journalists wrote about corrupt side of business and exposed government abuses of public life through magazines and newspapers during the 20th century. We see the term refers to John Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress, in which a character is so busy using a rake to clean up the muck that of this world that he does not raise his eyes to heaven. In the history of the Standard Oil Company, we see that this was a monthly serial from McClure's magazine. The writer Ida M. Tarbell, basically, her father had owned an oil company, and Rockefeller tried to force him to sell to him. And instead of, and we talked a little bit about this in the previous chapters when the moguls, but instead of selling, Rockefeller's like, fine, I'm going to take you out of the game. I'm going to ruin you, and you're not going to be able to compete with me. And basically being able to control the prices, lower them as low as he can, that would still make him a big enough profit, but still put Tarbell's family out of business, the oil business. And that's why she wrote about some of the corruption, the cutthroat methods of eliminating competition from Rockefeller. And Mr. Rockefeller has systematically played with loaded dice, she wrote about, and Tarbell charged. And it was doubtful if there has been a time since 1872 when he has run a race with a competitor and started fair. So basically, her journalism really went after Rockefeller, and eventually Rockefeller was forced to break up his monopoly and split into two companies. And what we see is that it did expose that Rockefeller, yes, even though you could argue, and whether you like Rockefeller or not, and yes, he was creating a monopoly in many aspects. He was trying to permit oil from getting out of control, and basically ensuring that that it doesn't go bankrupt, that certain businesses don't go bankrupt, and that prices are under a good setting control. But in that process, he still restricted competition and made it very hard for others to compete. So the antitrust law eventually came after him, with the government, forcing him to split. But this new type of journalism is happening, and it's growing during this time. We see the scientific method here, or sorry, scientific management is all in green right here. Many progressive leaders use experts to kind of look in society and how can we make the workplace more efficient. We see defending an Oregon law that limited women factory and laundry workers to a 10-hour day. Lawyer Louis D. Brindis paid little attention to the legal argument and focused on data produced by social scientists documenting the high cost of long working hours for both the individual and society. We see Frederick Wilson Winslow Taylor began using time and motion studies to prove efficiency by breaking up manufacturing tasks into simpler parts, kind of figuring out how can we make things go faster if we have more people. And so it was coined, the Taylorism became a management fad of industry reformers applied these scientific management or studies to see just how quickly each task could be performed. This would ultimately introduce the assembly lines. Not all workers could work at the same rate, so although the introduction of the assembly line did speed up production, the system required people to work like machines, and it did cause a high worker turnover rate, often due to injuries suffered by fatigued workers. And so the assembly line did help. It did make the process go faster, but it did, it didn't keep a lot of employees as it was promoted, but it did change the game a little bit, make it a little bit more efficient. So we do see that even in the automobile industry, automobile workers happy to prevent strikes. Henry Ford reduced the workday to 8 hours and paid workers $5 a day. This initiative attracted thousands of workers, but exhausted themselves as well. So Henry Ford tried to introduce the assembly line, and he gets a lot of credit for the success of the assembly line, able to turn out more cars. But we do see the main reason why Henry Ford wanted the workers to only work 8 hours and then also have some days off in the weekends is to basically get them out there to buy a T model Ford. We do see cities face a lot of social problems. We see large cities' political bosses rewarded their supporters with jobs and kickbacks and bribes. So this was a problem. We see politicians and their desire to make government more efficient, more responsive to its constituents. But ultimately, this is going to cause some distrust in the system. And so natural disasters really kind of highlight some of the important roles of city governments. We see in the 1900s, a tidal wave almost demolished Galveston, Texas. The politicians of the city council botched a huge relief and rebuilding job so badly that the Texas legislature appointed a 5-member commission of experts to kind of look over the situation. Each expert actually took a charge in the city department, and soon Galveston was able to rebuild due to the success that prompted the city to adopt a commission idea of form of government. And by 1917, 500 cities followed the Galveston sample by having a special council to deal with this. Flood in Dayton, Ohio in 1913 led to a widespread adoption of the council manager form of government, where you see that you have a council manager that handles all the business going on in the city and looking after the city. Stockton, Virginia already pioneered the system, which people elected a city council to make laws, and then the council appointed a manager who would then execute those laws. And he was trained and experienced in public administration to run the city departments. And by 1925, managers are administering 250 cities, and you actually have a city manager in Manford. So it just makes the job a lot easier. We are seeing cleaning up in the local governments, reforming the mayors. We're seeing this happen in certain cities like Detroit, Michigan, with Hazen Pingree and Tom Johnson of Cleveland, Ohio, during the in Detroit in the late 1800s, and then the 1900s, early 1900s. You see that in Cleveland, Ohio, for adding reforms to the government. Pingree instituted a fairer tax. He mostly focused on economics. He also lowered fares for public transportation, rooted out corruption, set up a system of work relief unemployment. Detroit city workers built schools, parks, municipal light plants to help grow the city. We see Johnson out of Cleveland, Ohio, was only one of 19 socialist mayors at this time, worked to institute progressive reforms for American cities, focusing on dismissing corruption, greed from private owners and of utilities such as gas works, water works, transit lines, converting utilities to publicly owned enterprises, which actually has made it pretty successful. That was a pretty good idea to allow the some more cities to control these utilities, because then the city can regulate much better of what is needed for its people. Johnson believed that citizens should play more of an active role in the city government, and held meetings in large circus tents to invite them to question officials. And so this is where we start to see the council meetings, where you can publicly go and question your council member for only 2 minutes, though. So it's kind of, I only have 2 minutes, but you can sign up and do it. So, even high schoolers like yourself. So we see local reformers coincide the progressive efforts at the state level, spurred by progressive governors. Many states passed laws to regulate railroads, mines, mills, telephone companies, and other large businesses as well. During this time, we see governors push states to pass laws to regulate large businesses under the progressive Republican leadership of Robert M. La Forest, which, by the way, he is one of your definitions, and it's probably a good thing that I am doing this now. Basically, we see with him is that is I'm going to go ahead and highlight here. Um, you can write your definition in green. So there you go. He was Wisconsin led the way regulating big business, fighting Bob LaFleur, served 3 terms as governor before entering 19 entering the Senate in 1906. Actually, do not write that one. That is my bad. I meant to do this. That's what I meant. LaFleur actually La Follette, sorry, Robert M. La Follette, um, during his time wanted to smash corporations but merely drive them out of politics during this time. Basically, what we see with him is that, as I fix that, there we go. LaFollette focused on the railroads, pretty much charging the same rate as other business property, set up commission to regulate rates, and forbade railroads to issue free passes to state officials. And other reform governors like Charles B. Aycock of North Carolina and James S. Hogg of Texas would follow suit. We see, as far as working children, protecting the children, a lot of child workers were dramatically rising. Reforms needed to be made to end child labor. Businesses that had hired children because they had performed unskilled jobs for lower wages, and also the children's small hands made it adept to handling small parts and tools. Rural immigrants and rural migrants often sent their children to go work in the factories as part of their family economy. Often wages were low for adults that every family member needed to work to pull their family out of poverty. However, children were ultimately prone in accidents caused by fatigue, developed serious health problems, and stunted their growth and really affected their health. We do see that formed in 1904, the National Child Labor Committee sent investigators to gather evidence of children working in harsh conditions. We see organized expeditions with photographers and statistics to dramatize the children's plight, and were joined by labor union members to argue that child labor lowered wages for all workers. These groups pressured national politicians to pass the Keating-Owen Act in 1916, prohibited the transportation across state lines of goods produced with child labor, and that would shortly start to phase out child labor. 2 years later, Supreme Court declared, though, that the act was unconstitutional due to interference with the state's rights to regulate labor, so that became a bit of a problem. The reforms did, however, secede nearly every state affecting legislation, banned child labor, and set maximum hours for children who could work. We do see Supreme Court sometimes took a more sympathetic view of the plight of workers in 1908. Mueller versus Oregon, Luis de Brendius, which we talked about, assisted the Florence Kelly and Josephine Goldmark, arguing about poor women working much more economically insecure than large corporations, asserting that women required the state's protections against powerful employers. Brendius convinced the court to uphold the Oregon law limiting women to a 10-hour workday. Other states responded enacting and strengthening laws to reduce women's work hours as well. We see that in brief and Bunting versus Oregon, 1970, persuaded the court to uphold a 10-hour workday for men. And progressives also succeeded in winning workers' compensation to aid families of workers who were hurt or killed on the job. And beginning in Maryland in 1902, one state after another passed legislation when it came to benefits in death cases. Your definition for recall is right here in green. William S. Urine prompted the state of Oregon to adopt the secret ballot, which is also known as the Australian ballot. The initiative, the referendum, and the recall as well came into play. Gave citizens a little bit more power. Citizens petitioned to place an initiative, a bill originated by the people rather than the lawmakers. So you can initiate a bill that could become a law someday. Then voters instead of legislators accepted or rejected the initiative by referendum, vote on the initiative. So then we initiate it, and then it can be voted on by the people. Now, the recall enabled voters to remove public officials from elected positions by forcing them to face another election before the end of their term if enough voters asked for it. But that one's a little bit difficult, more difficult. 1920, 20 states adapted at least one of these procedures. In 1899, Minnesota passed the first mandatory statewide primary system, which enabled voters, instead of political machines, to choose candidates for public office and a special popular election. About 2/3 of the states adopted a form of direct primary, where the people get to determine who gets to go. And so this would be played out as well in the 17th Amendment. It was the success of the direct primary that paved the way for the 17th Amendment to the Constitution. In 1913, each state legislature had chosen its own United States senators, which put even more power in the hands of the party bosses, wealthy corporation heads, forced senators to be more responsive to the public. Progressive push for a popular election of senators so we, the people, can decide who gets to go. Senate refused to go along with this at first, but eventually states began allowing voters to nominate senatorial candidates in direct primaries. So we get to decide who gets to go and represent in the election. And Congress approved the 17th Amendment in 1912, and its ratification in 1913 made direct election of senators the law of the land. So we see reform is happening in the voting aspects where our voices being heard and being able to elect our legislators and creating laws drew increased numbers for women in public life and focused renewed attention on the issue of women's suffrage. So that will do it for section 1. We'll have section 2 tomorrow. See you then.